When I grew up, I was raised in a good Presbyterian home, and as a good Presbyterian boy, I grew up with the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which, for those of you who have Presbyterian background, you know that question and answer well. What is the chief end of man? And the chief end of man is to glorify and enjoy him. What does that mean? I remember growing up thinking about that, thinking this is the reason why I exist on this planet, but I have no idea what that means. When people think about the glory of God, they sometimes think of fame. They sometimes think of power. Sometimes you think of luminosity, as Lewis put it in his sermon, The Weight of Glory. What does that mean? Because Paul says, whether you eat or drink, intensely real and mundane things, do it for the glory of God. And I would add to that, how do we work for the glory of God? Does that mean it shows out in our character and our ethics? So it's really just about the kind of person we are? Or does it actually work out into the very work that we do and the product of our work? And as we think about this larger question, what does it mean to live for the glory of God and to work for the glory of God? I want to turn our attention to Isaiah 6, a passage that perhaps some of us are familiar with. This is Isaiah's famous call. And in this pretty dramatic vision, Isaiah sees the very throne room of God. And as he sees God, he also sees the holiest of his creatures encircling him. And they are crying out to each other, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." And the earth is full of his glory. Now, I have heard that passage several times. I've read that passage. It's a pretty popular passage. But it wasn't until when I opened up a commentary to read what that passage meant that began to open my eyes to understand how important the glory of God was with respect to my work. And the commentator wrote this: the holiness of God represents his invisible internal quality. It is the essence of who he is in his invisible form. But his glory is the outward expression. It's the visible representation of his holiness. So holiness describes the very internal quality and character of God, while the glory of God represents the visible manifestations of those characteristics. And then the commentator went on, and he says the more literal translation of this could be rendered this way: the fullness of the earth is his glory. And that for me had a very different nuance, because when I think about the earth is full of his glory, I think of the Grand Canyon. I think of the beauty of creation. But with that passage, that nuance in that translation, the fullness of the earth, harkened back to Genesis 1. That mandate that God had given to Adam and Eve, to humanity: go and fill the earth, cultivate it, subdue it. And while Isaiah is in awe of the throne room of God, the angels are in awe of the earth. Think about that. Isaiah is completely awestruck by the vision of God's throne room, and the holiest creatures, arguably created by God, are in awe of the earth and what's happening here. And they're saying, this is the glory of God. And I try to understand this, and an illustration that kind of helps me understand this: perhaps I came to you, and I came to your home with a box full of ants. And I said to the ants, go ahead and become the Eiffel Tower. And the ants would slowly climb on top of each other's backs, and they would construct a multi-layered vision of the Eiffel Tower. At some level, you'd be impressed by the ants, but you would be more in awe of me. You would be saying in your mind, who is this man who has such power to control these beings with such puny minds? What kind of glory is this? And that is what the angels are doing as they look at this earth. They know the ravages of the perversion of humanity. They know how broken this world is. And yet, nevertheless, despite all the brokenness that sin has created in our lives and the world around us, the glory of God continues to persist. And they see that. And Paul says, ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal qualities, his divine nature, has clearly been seen in creation. And what's important to underscore there is ever since creation, meaning this is an ongoing revelation of God even to our present day. When we go back to Genesis 1, we see a God who creates realms, such as light, and the sky and the seas and the land, and then he begins to fill and flourish it. And the filling and the flourishing and the creating of the structures, these are manifestations of his character. This is his glory. This is who I am. If you want to understand my glory, you have to look at the things that are visible and tangible. The glory of God is immensely and intensely tangible. It's not theoretical. And we see that in society in very concrete ways. When you look at the way sociologists describe the formation of any society, they will argue that there are 5 primary spheres that are essential for any society to endure. The first one is family. The second one is an economic structure. The third one is a form of government. The fourth one is arts and culture. And the fifth one is religion. And if we look at each of those primary building blocks of a society, you can ask the question, how does this manifest the glory of God? Well, if you look at each of these spheres, let's start with the family, there are certain qualities without which that sphere of family cannot exist. For example, without care or nurture, a family cannot exist very long. I have a 2-year-old. This has been made starkly very real to me. That child is so dependent. There are times where you just wish you could say, can you do it yourself? Can you dress yourself? Can you just feed yourself once? And you realize, compared to the rest of the animal world, how inefficient it is to raise a family. There are certain animals that as soon as they are born can start to walk and feed themselves. And I ask myself, as the pinnacle of God's creation, why is it that we have to endure such pain for these many years? And part of the reality is it begins to cultivate this thing that we call care and nurture. We learn this hard task of caring for our family, realizing it comes at a great cost and sacrifice. That care and nurture that you experience in such a real and intense way, from the sleepless nights to the early mornings, that helps us understand when the Bible says, I am your father. That is not a theoretical concept. There is something very real that touches your heart that speaks of a fatherly love, affection, protection, and care. You see, if you don't have the sphere or institution of family, you would never know what it means when God nurtures us, when he protects us. It's a father, it's a mother that begins to communicate in real ways, tangible ways, this idea of God's love and care. Unfortunately, the other side is true. If you were raised in a context where one or both parents were not there for you, where they were not representative of God's love. And when you read the fact, for example, if you had an absentee father or a father that was abusive, there are a lot of people that would say, I don't like the idea of God being father. I would much rather see God as mother. And you can see how our human experience in this world begins to shape our understanding of God's very character and nature. And what holds true for the sphere of family is equally true for the other spheres, those foundational spheres in the society, meaning when economic structures do not provide opportunities, economies will not flourish, and there's ultimately then a diminution of a society because assets get frozen. You can't get loans. You can't get capital to be able to get money to fulfill the orders that you have. all of a sudden our society comes to a relative standstill, and we saw that very clearly in 2008. And then the Bible speaks about a God who has created this world with such abundance. But if you grow up in a society where you can't even get a loan to go to college, where you can't get a loan so that you can open up a business, what does that mean that God has created this amazing world pregnant with such potential and opportunity? You don't know. Whereas today, if you grow up in an economic climate, which ours thankfully is becoming more, is moving towards, you get excited when you think about this world that God has created with such potential and such opportunity. And I could go through each of those spheres, but in a very foundational way, you can begin to see how every sector of our society possesses a core essence that begins to manifest the glory of God in very tangible and visible ways. When you speak of God's justice, the sphere of our government should help us understand what that is. When you think about the arts, and we hear that God is a creative and imaginative God, you look at the arts, and the arts begin to help us understand, wow, I never knew how creative people can be with whatever medium you're looking at. And this is our calling. When we go to work, we have to understand that what is at stake is a visible expression of God's very character. To be able to understand, how does my work visibly display God's glory and His character? For my work in New York, a lot of people are just sitting in front of a computer screen on their Excel spreadsheets, creating what I would consider masterful spreadsheets. And if they describe their work, they would just say, oh, all I do is plug in numbers and formulas, and it's not exciting at all. And I say, well, you know what you're creating? You are taking literally thousands, if not millions of data points, creating a spreadsheet, and all of a sudden you're crunching all that data in milliseconds. Things that would have taken people months, if not years, to process through, you can process through because of your skill in just a few seconds. Tell me that's not the glory of God. And when our hearts and our minds are reoriented to this reality, when you see whether it's a great Americano or cappuccino made, or whether it is a spreadsheet that shows you all of the different scenarios of the different vacations you can go on, or whether it's craftsmanship in which the outside of the furniture is as well and thoughtfully done as the inside of the furniture. And we begin to understand these are not just artifacts of human hands. These are very expressions of God's grace and His glory to us. And when we align our hearts to that reality, we can't help but to worship Him. And we worship Him in our work and through our work. And when people begin to see that the product of our hands, what we spend 40, 50, 60 hours a week doing, is an expression of our identity as people created in the image of God, created to bring Him glory, there is a transformative effect that has a leavening effect upon all those around us, because you see someone in line with who they were created to be. Thank you very much.